Now, let's think about how it could play out in the future. And there's Zimbabwe and Weimar Republic to study, and the U.S. during the Great Depression. But you've got to be careful in terms of how you study them because Weimar Republic, Germany, or Brazil is hyperinflation. The Great Depression is deflationary depression. So that's a completely different game where the currency actually appreciates. Um, because the supply has been restricted, whereas in hyperinflation, the supply is overinflated and the currency depreciates. So the way that that could unfold in over the next 10 years or at some point in the next century, I mean, it's guaranteed to happen in some countries in this century. It happens every decade in at least some countries, right? But if we're talking about sort of the Western countries, especially the US dollar, we want to look to see if it's either going to be a controlled or uncontrolled situation, and we can't, really gauge either way. We can only speculate. So controlled would be the ideal, smooth, gradual transition to CBDCs. I'm not saying CBDCs are ideal. I'm saying they are planning on doing this reset either way. It would be preferable if it was a slow, gradual transition to CBDCs, a long beta test, a long test working out the kinks of the software, not trying to phase out cash immediately. They are planning to phase out cash. They've done it in Nigeria thus far, and by they I mean the think tanks behind a lot of these policies, World Economic Forum, these types of people, the bankers and these types of commissions that influence policy and are on record saying it's going to be policy for all countries. And the Fed has spoken about replacing cash, phasing out cash. They're on record. They're launching, I think, the CBDC this year or next year. It's being launched in Thailand already. It's been launched in China for 4 or 5 years. China's coming out of the beta test. So this is happening. So I'd rather see a smooth, gradual transition to that and relative stability in the economy and the U.S. dollar, especially for guys like us where we primarily don't live in the U.S. but sell into the U.S. Um, we want that economy relatively as healthy as possible and stable. I'd like to see it still going through the commercial banking system. There was a point where they were talking about CBDCs being wholesale, where you'd have an account with the Fed, which, as a foreigner who doesn't live in America, I could see a ton of problems with that and getting KYC'd. And, what would I do with my US dollars that I own in these foreign bank accounts? How's that going to work? I would just imagine that would be a damn mess. But it looks like they're going through the commercial banking system to where ideally all the updates to the system are made on the back end, and your currency accounts in your banks stay the same, your balance stays the same, and it's now just and they've, instead of calling it Fed coin, it's still called the US dollar. They've stayed with that brand, and um, it's just now denominated in CBDC, but nothing's actually changed in your account or your app or your ability to access your funds, except that wire transfers and transfers between accounts would now be settled immediately without the 4-day manual wire transfers on Swift, where like an employee has to approve the thing. It would just be a lot more streamlined and things of that nature. That's sort of the best case scenario, and it looks like, I think that's what they're attempting to do. I would certainly hope so. Um, and if you've heard about these experiments with programmable money that they want to do and will do, geofencing money into certain locations, I would like to see those things not implemented immediately. And I think they won't implement those things immediately because they're going to want to attempt to promote CBDCs as a good thing and not to create a bunch of chaos. I think that's something they'll do once everybody's already on CBDCs, because it's going to be a big sell to put, once people figure out what these are, to put people on CBDCs where you're paying for everything in a QR code and you're phasing out cash. Like, especially the older generation, is going to have a problem with that. So they're really going to have to get soft sold into these things. I also think there's probably going to be some incentives for using them, like stimulus checks or some money into your accounts for, people willing to do the beta test and things of that nature. The non-ideal scenario is the one similar to Brazil, where through some factor outside of the control of the people in charge of monetary policy, either based on a deflationary pressure on the money supply or hyperinflation, probably provoked by a major shock to the system, like, for example, OPEC no longer supporting the petrodollar system, and instead of selling their oil denominated in USD, they sell it in a BRICS based currency, or, um, in Bitcoin or euros, or, euro backed by gold, or whatever the thing is, right? I would say probably the biggest challenge to the petrodollar would be the yuan, or the whatever the BRICS based currency is going to be. The BRICS countries are Brazil, China, India, and Russia. And they're all scared now that Russia's been removed from the SWIFT system. They're worried that that could happen to them. They've already been planning this in advance, and they've sort of accelerated the timeline on it, so that, removing Russia from the SWIFT system was probably a gamble that's could potentially really hurt the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency in the future, and it kind of accelerate the timeline of that being moved off the reserve currency. Now, that doesn't mean that the yuan would replace it. It's probably more likely there's multiple currencies, but it could replace the U.S. being the sole petrodollar. Um, if the Saudis and the other OPEC companies would be willing to sell their oil in terms of yuan, or the BRICS-based um, currency, and there's rumors that it's going to be backed by some type of commodity hedge, or by gold directly, and that would be the selling feature of using the BRICS, is that it's a quote unquote hard money system, as the U.S. dollar was until 1971, backed by gold. Whether they do it or not remains to be seen, but that could be the selling feature. So all those things combined could really um, create a real shock to the system, because for the U.S., being able to expand their credit supply um, in such large proportions, right? Which is what other people refer to as printing money. It's actually, the Fed creating credit, and most of it's the commercial banks creating credit. They need $10 trillion in global trade. That's what's accounted for in U.S. dollar global trade right now. So if, let's say, the U.S. was removed from the petrodollar system, right? That might be 2, 3 trillion, $4 trillion there. I don't know the exact numbers of the U.S. dollar not being traded, right? Which is a real problem when the country is used to being able to expand the credit supply at a certain amount, and all of a sudden they either have to decide to, reduce the credit supply significantly across the board and risk deflation, or continue to print the same amount of money but with 40% less demand during, for yearly global trade, and risk an inflation scenario. So, in my opinion, it can go either way. The guys in our brotherhood, revolutionarylifestyledesign.com/brotherhood, which is our strategy group for how to survive and thrive in the next decade, completely legally, of course, just learning how to play the new game and how to make sure that we're all wealthy, healthy, and happy, and have our freedoms, um, are leaning more towards hyperinflation, but I could see just as likely a deflationary scenario. You know, over the last 30, 40 years, they've leaned towards inflation. It would be, you know, difficult for a politician to try and pull off what was done in the Depression, where, it was austerity and it was deflation, but their hand might be forced if hyperinflation or higher inflation, if they start to see that coming, the deflation alternative might be preferable than a Weimar Republic style hyperinflation, if that's what they see in the cards. Um, so that's controlled versus uncontrolled.